The grand palace was lit with thousands of lanterns, their golden glow reflecting off the marble walls. The entire kingdom had gathered to witness the royal wedding of Prince Aedric and the mysterious Lady Seraphina, a noble woman from a distant land. Rumors had swirled for months. Some whispered that she was hideously deformed, others that she had been cursed at birth. No one had ever seen her face, for she was always veiled. Prince Aedric had no say in the marriage. It was a political alliance arranged by his father, King Aedric, to strengthen ties with Seraphina's kingdom. Aedric, young and proud, had been furious at the arrangement. He had imagined his future wife to be a ghastly sight, a woman so repulsive that even her own people hid her face. As she walked down the aisle in her flowing white gown, her veil thick and opaque, Aedric barely glanced at her. He kept his expression cold and unreadable. When the vows were exchanged, he forced the words from his mouth, feeling no joy, only obligation. The feast that followed was grand, yet Aedric barely touched his food. Every time he stole a glance at Seraphina, he felt a strange mix of curiosity and resentment. She sat silently, her hands folded delicately in her lap, her face still obscured. She barely spoke, responding only with nods or soft words. That night, when the celebrations ended, Aedric led Seraphina to their chambers. His steps were slow, reluctant. He dreaded the moment he would have to face his bride in private. Would she expect him to share a bed with her? Would he be forced to look upon her face and hide his disgust? Inside the chamber, the air was thick with tension. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting warm shadows on the walls. Seraphina stood near the window, her back to him. "You do not have to pretend, my prince," she said suddenly, her voice soft but firm. "I know you did not wish for this marriage." Aedric exhaled sharply. "I do not believe we should lie to each other. This was not my choice." Seraphina turned slowly, her hands reaching up to the veil. "Then let us not live in pretense," she whispered. With one smooth motion, she removed the veil. Aedric's breath caught in his throat. His entire body tensed. She was beautiful. Not just beautiful, breathtaking. Her long dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face that was impossibly delicate. Her eyes were like the deepest pools of the ocean, shimmering with intelligence and sadness. Her lips were soft and full, her skin flawless. Aedric felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. This was not what he had expected. This was not what he had been told. Seraphina's lips curved slightly. "You seem surprised." Aedric struggled to find his voice. He paused, feeling like a fool. Why do you hide your face?" A shadow passed over her expression. "Because beauty is both a blessing and a curse, my prince." There was something in her tone, something that sent a shiver down his spine. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. She stepped closer, her gaze locking onto his. "You may have married me out of duty, but there are things about me you do not yet know." The fire crackled louder, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Aedric felt his heart beat faster. "What things?" he murmured. Seraphina only smiled, a knowing, mysterious smile. "Perhaps you should ask yourself, my prince, why would a kingdom hide the face of a woman like me?" Aedric swallowed, his throat dry. He had no answer. But deep inside, he knew one thing. His wedding night had just become far more complicated than he ever could have imagined. Aedric took a step back, his mind racing. The woman before him, his wife, was nothing like he had expected. He had prepared himself for disappointment, for duty, for a lifetime of tolerating a woman he did not desire. Instead, he stood before a woman so stunning that he found himself unable to look away. But it was not just her beauty that unsettled him. It was her words. Why would a kingdom hide the face of a woman like me? The question echoed in his mind. He studied her, searching for a hidden flaw, some imperfection that would explain the veil. But there was nothing, and yet he sensed there was more to Seraphina than her appearance. "You're playing games," he said finally, his voice guarded. She tilted her head. "Am I?" Aedric clenched his jaw. "If you are not deformed, if you are not cursed, then why were you hidden?" Seraphina sighed and turned away from him, walking toward the grand window that overlooked the moonlit palace gardens. "Because men like you see beauty as a prize," she said quietly. "They do not see the danger in it." His brow furrowed. "Danger?" She glanced at him over her shoulder. "Would you like to hear a story, my prince?" Aedric crossed his arms. "If it will give me answers, then yes." Seraphina nodded. "Then listen well." She turned fully to face him, her expression unreadable. "In my kingdom, I was known as the Jewel of Ilarion. From the moment I was born, people whispered that my beauty was a gift from the gods. Some called it a blessing, others called it a curse. My father, the king, feared that my face alone would bring war to our lands." Aedric frowned. "That's absurd." She smiled faintly. "Is it? When I was barely 16, men came from all corners of the world to claim me. Some were kings, others were warlords. They offered gold, land, armies, anything to make me theirs. And when my father refused, they turned to bloodshed." Aedric's stomach tightened. He had heard of wars waged over power, wealth, vengeance. But over a woman? It seemed unthinkable. And yet, the way she spoke, the way her gaze darkened, it was not a lie. Seraphina continued, her voice softer now. "One suitor did not accept my father's refusal. He set fire to our city walls, slaughtered our soldiers, and demanded my hand in marriage. My father, desperate to protect me, had only one option left." Aedric's voice was quiet. "He veiled you." She nodded. "He told the world that I was deformed, that I was too hideous to be seen. He kept me locked away, far from prying eyes, far from the greed of men." She paused. "Until now." Aedric exhaled slowly. He had thought himself unfortunate to be forced into this marriage. Now he realized it was Seraphina who had been caged her entire life. "Do you think I will demand war for you?" he asked. Seraphina stepped closer, her piercing eyes searching his. "I think you do not yet understand the weight of what you have inherited, my prince. My father gave me to you, not because he wished for peace, but because he wished to be rid of me." Aedric felt a strange chill creep down his spine. "You believe your father feared losing you," he said. "But what if he feared what you might become?" Seraphina held his gaze, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. "Perhaps, my prince," she whispered, "you should ask yourself this. What happens when a caged bird is finally set free?" Aedric swallowed hard. For the first time that night, he felt truly afraid. Aedric had always considered himself a man of reason, unmoved by superstition or the whims of fate. And yet, as he stood before his wife, his mysterious, breathtaking, veiled wife, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. A deep, unsettling sense of foreboding. Seraphina watched him carefully, as if measuring his reaction. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation. She was not a woman desperate for his favor, She was something else entirely. "I do not believe in fairy tales," Aedric said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. "And I do not believe that beauty alone can start wars." Seraphina arched a delicate brow. "Then you are fortunate, my prince. You have never had to live as a woman whose face is worth kingdoms." He took a step toward her, his pulse quickening. "You speak as if you are a weapon, not a person." She tilted her head, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "Perhaps I am both." Aedric's breath caught in his throat. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, sending the candle flames flickering. The shadows in the chamber danced wildly, stretching and contorting along the stone walls. For the first time that night, Aedric was struck by an uneasy thought. Perhaps it was not just men who had feared Seraphina's beauty. Perhaps her father had hidden her for another reason. "Tell me something," he said, his voice quieter now. "Did you ever wish to be free?" Seraphina's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes, something deep and unreadable. "Every day." Her answer was barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of years, of longing, of something else he could not yet name. Aedric exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. He had spent months resenting this marriage, assuming he had been shackled to a miserable fate. But now, standing before Seraphina, he realized the truth. He was not the one who had been trapped. She was. And now, she was here, in his kingdom, in his palace, unveiled. A thought chilled him to the bone. What happens when a caged bird is finally set free? He did not know, but he had the sinking feeling he was about to find out. The room felt different now, heavier somehow, as if an unseen force had shifted in the air. Aedric could not look away from Seraphina. She stood before him, untouched by the fear he expected a new bride to have, untouched by the gratitude he had seen in other women, desperate for acceptance. She did not fear him, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken truths. Then Seraphina turned away, her fingers grazing the carved wooden frame of the window. The moonlight kissed her skin, making her seem almost ethereal. Aedric exhaled slowly. "So, what now?" She glanced over her shoulder, amusement flickering in her dark eyes. "You are my husband now, are you not? Should that not be your decision?" Aedric frowned. It was true by law, she belonged to him now. But something about Seraphina made it clear. She did not belong to anyone. He stepped closer, studying her face. "You're not what I expected." Her lips curved slightly. "Good." He narrowed his eyes. "Is that what you wanted? For me to be unprepared?" Seraphina's gaze lingered on his. "Does it matter?" Aedric clenched his jaw. She was dancing around him, teasing him with half-truths and riddles. He had spent his life in control, dictating his own fate. But now, with Seraphina, he felt like he was playing a game whose rules he didn't understand. She turned fully to face him, her expression softer now. "I know you did not want this marriage, my prince. Neither did I, but here we are." Aedric studied her carefully. There was no bitterness in her tone, no resentment, just a quiet acceptance. Perhaps, he realized, Seraphina was just as much a prisoner of duty as he was. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. "Then tell me, what do you want?" Seraphina's eyes flickered with something unreadable. She took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. Aedric held his ground, his heart pounding against his ribs. Then she whispered, "Freedom." The word sent a chill down his spine. Freedom. It was not the answer he expected. She could have asked for anything: his protection, his love, his loyalty. But she asked for freedom, and he had no idea what that truly meant. The fire crackled behind them, casting long shadows on the walls. Seraphina held his gaze, waiting, testing him. Aedric knew in that moment his bride was not an ornament, not a prize to be won. She was something far more dangerous, and he was only beginning to understand the depth of what he had just married. Aedric stood still, watching her, feeling the weight of her words settle deep in his chest. Freedom. Of all the things she could have asked for, she had chosen that. And yet, she had been given to him, bound to him in a marriage neither of them had chosen. Freedom, he repeated, his voice quieter now. What does that mean to you? Seraphina studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether to tell him the truth. Then, she took another step forward, so close now that he could see the faint rise and fall of her breath. My entire life, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I have been watched, guarded, hidden away like some forbidden treasure. Men have spoken of me like I am a prize to be won, a possession to be claimed. Even my own father feared what would happen if I were allowed to make my own choices. Aedric swallowed, the truth of her words cutting through him like a blade. He had seen it before, how noble women were treated like pawns, married off for power, for alliances. But Seraphina's case was different. She had been caged, not just for politics, but because of something more, something darker. I never had the chance to be anything more than what others decided I should be, she continued. And now I have been given to you. Just another man who thinks he owns me. Aedric tensed. I do not. She raised a hand, silencing him. Perhaps not yet. But tell me, my prince, how long will it be before you do? The question struck him harder than he expected. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he had no intention of controlling her. But could he truly say that? Had he not, only hours ago, resented this marriage because he thought she was an ugly burden he would be forced to endure? Had he not assumed she would be something he had to deal with, rather than someone with a mind, with desires of her own? Seraphina tilted her head, watching him with quiet amusement. You don't know what to do with me, do you? Aedric exhaled, running a hand through his hair. No, he admitted. I don't. Her expression softened, and for the first time that night, he saw something genuine in her gaze. A flicker of understanding, perhaps even relief. Good, she said softly. Aedric frowned. Why is that good? Because, she murmured, stepping back, it means you are not like the others. The tension in the room shifted. It was no longer sharp, no longer a silent battle between them. It was something else now, something fragile, uncertain. Aedric watched as Seraphina moved toward the grand four-poster bed, running her fingers lightly over the embroidered silk. I will not pretend, she said finally. I will not play the role of the obedient wife, nor will I shrink beneath your power. She looked at him, her eyes dark and steady. But I will not fight you either. Not unless you give me reason to. Aedric let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That seems fair. She nodded once. Then we understand each other. For the first time since this marriage had been arranged, Aedric felt something unexpected. Relief. Seraphina was not the burden he had feared. She was something far more dangerous. And yet, he could not bring himself to regret it. Not yet. Not at all. The palace was quieter than Aedric had ever known it to be. The distant sounds of servants moving through the halls had faded. Even the torches lining the stone corridors flickered in silence, their golden light barely pushing back the shadows of the night. And yet, Aedric could not sleep. He lay in his chambers, his mind restless, his thoughts returning again and again to Seraphina. She had taken the side of the bed farthest from him, her body relaxed, but he could tell she was not asleep either. She had not spoken since their last exchange, nor had she looked at him again. She simply lay there, her breathing steady, as if she belonged there, as if she had always belonged there. And that unsettled him more than anything else. Aedric had thought marriage would be an inconvenience, a necessary evil for the sake of duty. He had assumed his wife would be meek, or at the very least, afraid of him, grateful even for the life she had been given. But Seraphina was neither meek nor afraid. She did not look at him with hope or expectation. She did not cower, nor did she try to charm him. She simply existed, unapologetic and unyielding. He turned onto his side, watching the faint rise and fall of her chest. "I have questions," he admitted into the darkness. Seraphina did not move. "I imagine you do." Aedric frowned. "If your beauty has caused so much trouble, why unveil yourself now? Why not remain hidden?" Seraphina was silent for a long moment. Then softly she said, "Because I am done hiding." Aedric exhaled, shaking his head. "You speak as if you had a choice." Her head turned slightly toward him, her dark eyes gleaming in the candlelight. "Don't I?" Aedric studied her, the way she held herself, the quiet defiance in her voice. For so long, he had believed himself in control of his life, bound only by duty and responsibility. But Seraphina, she had lived her entire life behind a veil, and yet she spoke as if she had more power than he did. "Is that why your father sent you away?" he asked. "Because he knew you would never accept being caged forever?" Seraphina's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Perhaps." Aedric let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "So I was not given a bride. I was given a storm waiting to break." Seraphina's smile grew. "And are you afraid, my prince?" Aedric met her gaze, his pulse steady. "Not yet." She hummed softly, turning back onto her side, her back to him once more. "Then sleep," she murmured. "You'll need your strength." Aedric frowned. "For what?" But Seraphina said nothing more. He lay there for a long time, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breathing, feeling the weight of her presence beside him. And for the first time in his life, Prince Aedric had no idea what would happen next. The days that followed were anything but ordinary. Aedric had expected his new wife to be like the other noble women of the court, graceful, obedient, quiet. But Seraphina was none of those things. She moved through the palace like a queen, though she had not yet been crowned. She did not ask permission to roam the halls. She did not wait to be introduced before speaking. And most of all, she did not shrink in the presence of the nobles, who whispered behind their hands about the mysterious veiled bride who had suddenly revealed herself. The court had been in an uproar the morning after their wedding. The rumors spread like wildfire, some claiming she was a goddess in human form, others whispering that she had used sorcery to bewitch the prince. Some even murmured that her beauty was unnatural, a curse rather than a gift. Aedric had ignored the gossip, but the moment Seraphina entered the grand dining hall, all eyes turned to her. She walked with a quiet confidence, her dark hair cascading down her back, her silk gown flowing around her like water. Even the queen, Aedric's mother faltered at the sight of her. Seraphina met every gaze with calm indifference, as if she were the one judging them and not the other way around. Aedric watched, fascinated. His mother, Queen Lysara, cleared her throat, regaining her composure. "My dear," she said with a tight smile, "we were just discussing the preparations for the upcoming royal tour. Aedric will be traveling through the eastern provinces soon." Seraphina took a seat beside Aedric, unbothered by the attention. "How fortunate for him." Aedric almost smirked at the way his mother's lips pressed into a thin line. The queen lifted her goblet, masking her irritation. "It is important for a ruler to be seen by his people." She gave Seraphina a pointed look, and for his queen to be respected. A challenge. Aedric tensed, waiting for Seraphina's reaction, but she merely tilted her head. "Respect is earned, Your Majesty, not gifted like a piece of jewelry." A stunned silence fell over the room. No one had ever spoken to Queen Lysara that way. Aedric suppressed a chuckle. The queen's smile never wavered, but her grip on her goblet tightened. "And how do you intend to earn yours?" Seraphina met her gaze evenly. "By ensuring that no one mistakes my silence for weakness." A murmur rippled through the courtiers. Some looked amused, others horrified. Aedric leaned back in his chair, watching his mother struggle to decide whether to be insulted or impressed. Seraphina had just declared herself as more than a bride. She was a force to be reckoned with. And Aedric had the sinking feeling that the palace, and perhaps the entire kingdom, would never be the same again. The days turned into weeks, and Seraphina continued to unsettle the court with her presence. But something strange began to happen. Where once the nobles whispered against her, they now watched her with admiration. She was unlike any princess the kingdom had ever known. She did not waste her time on meaningless gossip or petty rivalries. Instead, she walked among the people, listening to their concerns, speaking to the merchants and farmers with the same respect she gave the lords and ladies of the court. And Aedric? He found himself captivated. He had thought this marriage would be a burden, a duty he would have to endure. But Seraphina was not a burden. She was a fire that burned away his expectations, a storm that breathed life into the halls of the palace. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, Aedric finally spoke the words that had been on his mind for weeks. "I was wrong about you," he admitted. Seraphina turned, her dark eyes filled with quiet amusement. "I know." Aedric chuckled, shaking his head. "You were never meant to be hidden away." She smirked. "No, I wasn't." He studied her, the way the wind played with her hair, the way the moonlight softened her features. And for the first time, he saw her not as an obligation, but as a choice. His choice. "Stay by my side," he said softly. "Not because you are my wife, but because I need you, because this kingdom needs you." Seraphina was silent for a moment. Then, with a smile, she reached for his hand. "I will," she whispered. And in that moment, Aedric knew. He had not just gained a wife. He had found his queen. Together they would rule, not as a king and his obedient bride, but as equals, as partners. And for the first time in his life, Aedric did not fear the future, because with Seraphina beside him, he knew anything was possible. The end.